Wet clay has a smell that stays in the hands a whole day, and Charlotte Fenwick came to the grandest ball of her life with the ghost of it still under her nails. She stood at the edge of the Duke of Thornleigh's blazing saloon, 40 feet from the man she was to marry, and heard him raise his glass to 400 people and tell them that a duke plants his name in a fortune, not a fen. He believed he was throwing away a plain girl and a patch of mud. He was throwing away the one crossing in all of England his name could never be made without. The ball at Thornleigh Hall that autumn was called a betrothal ball, and every carriage in 3 counties had come rocking out through the turning woods to hear the name of the bride. That was reckoned a great condescension in the 7th Duke of Thornleigh, Sebastian, 31, dark-haired and broad-shouldered, and beautiful in the way that makes a whole room arrange itself toward one man. Because everyone knew, or thought they knew, that his grace was to lower himself to marry into trade. The candles alone were a small fortune spent to say otherwise, and the long mirrors doubled the silk and the diamonds and the appetite until the saloon seemed to hold 1,000 people, every one waiting to see which quiet nobody the magnificent Duke had settled upon. What the mirrors did not show, because mirrors are honest only about surfaces, was that the 7th Duke of Thornleigh was land poor to the bone. He held 40,000 acres and could not raise 4,000 pounds in ready coin against the whole of them. The land was beautiful and barren, chalk upland and steep-hanging wood, and his grandfather had drunk the last liquid money in the family 50 years before. Sebastian had one asset left unspent, and it was not gold. It was an idea. He meant to cut a navigation, a canal of locks and still water, from the coal country in the north of the county down to the sea, and to carry his own name on it into the next century, and to grow rich on the tolls of every barge that passed. A royal charter was very nearly his. The plans were drawn. There was only one difficulty, and the difficulty was water. And the water lay in the low green valley of the Wenn. For the Wenn Valley, the fen, the fashionable called it, wrinkling their noses, was the single gap in the hills through which any navigation must pass, and the man who had spent 30 years learning its every drain and treacherous soft yard was Mr. Jonas Fenwick. Born on that boggy ground, he had made himself, out of tide tables and spirit levels and pure stubbornness, into the finest practical engineer of low water in the north of England, a self-taught fen-man whom the great London engineers wrote to for advice and the local gentry would not seat above the salt. He had surveyed the whole navigation himself, walked it stake by stake, and left it drawn true to the inch. And he had one child, a grave, gray-eyed daughter he had taught as he would have taught a son, and a small freehold that happened to hold the only firm crossing in the valley of the Wenn. Charlotte Fenwick was 22, dark-haired, plainly dressed, with steady hazel eyes, and a way of going very still that unsettled chattering people. Men called her sensible when they wished to be kind and plain when they did not, and both sorts overlooked that she could read a fall of land the way other women read a face, and a face the way her father read a fall of land, once, completely, without rounding. That was her father's whole religion, and hers, you do not round the figure. You state the true one, though it cost you, and let the world arrange itself around the truth or not. She had buried Jonas Fenwick 4 weeks before the ball. The clay was scarcely settled on him. She had come out to Thornleigh in her one good gown of dove grey, with a small jet mourning brooch at her throat, because the man she was promised to had commanded it, and because she still believed. That autumn, that a promise was a firm crossing and not a soft yard. The match had been made the way such matches are, in a whisper. The Duke's agent, a dry-harried man named Sowerby, had put it to his master flatly. The charter is worthless without the Wenn crossing. The crossing is Fenwick's. Fenwick will sell it to no man living. But Fenwick has a daughter and a mortal illness, and a duke who married the daughter would hold the valley for the price of a wedding ring. So Sebastian had ridden down to the low green valley he privately despised, been charming to a dying engineer and his quiet girl, and set upon Charlotte's finger a ring, a Thornleigh sapphire the color of deep water. And Jonas Fenwick, who knew to the shilling why a duke would stoop to his door, had looked at his daughter's steady face and let himself hope, at the very last, that the great man might come to see what he was getting. He died believing his girl would be a duchess, and safe, and never again seated below the salt. He was wrong about the duchess. He was righter than he knew about what the duke was getting. The turn came at the ball an hour before the announcement, and it came as ruin so often does, wearing pale silk and a brilliant smile. Lady Georgiana Wenn was the diamond of that season, the only child of the Earl of Marchmont, golden and laughing and dowered, so the town said, with £60,000. She had been steered to Thornleigh by a father who needed a duke the way a sinking man needs a spar, and she brought, tucked behind the dowry, a thing more precious to Sebastian than her beauty, her father's confident promise that the navigation need not stoop to any fen-man's girl at all, for Marchmont's engineers had found a better line, a bold cutting straight through the eastern hills that wanted no crossing of the Wenn. It was a lie, though the Duke did not yet know it. The eastern hills were solid rock, and the levels of fantasy drawn to catch exactly one ambitious land-poor man. He could not bear it. That was the whole of it, not greed, though he was ambitious, and not cruelty for its own sake, but the plain unbearable shame of being seen to need a fen-man's daughter. And so, when the music paused between the sets and the room turned to him expecting one name, the 7th Duke of Thornleigh lifted his glass and smiled his beautiful smile and gave them another. "My friends," he said, into the lull, in the carrying voice that had been bred into his family for 200 years, "you have come to hear of a betrothal, and you shall. I am the most fortunate man in England. Lady Georgiana Wenn has consented to be my duchess." And in the roar of astonishment and delight that followed, the surge toward Georgiana, the Earl's red triumphant face, the fans and the flung congratulations. He turned, still smiling, to the grave gray figure standing by the pillar in her dead father's mourning, and, because some devil of shame required a witness for its cruelty, he added, lower but not low enough, so that 100 people heard it and repeated it to the other 3. "You did not truly imagine it, Miss Fenwick? A duke plants his name in a fortune, not a fen. The ring reverts. Naturally, it was a loan against a match that will not now be made." Then he held out his open hand for it, in front of them all. Charlotte Fenwick did not flush, and did not sway, and did not look at the floor. She would remember all her life the smell of hot wax and crushed roses, the particular sound 400 people make when they are delighted by someone else's ruin. She drew the sapphire from her finger. It came away easily. She had lost flesh nursing and burying her father, and set it into the Duke's waiting palm without haste, and she looked at him once, levelly, the way her father had taught her to look at a treacherous soft yard of ground, taking its true measure. And she said, in a voice that carried further than she meant, because the room had gone quiet to hear her break, "My father drew your navigation stake by stake, your grace. He walked every yard of the ground you are about to plant your name in. I hope, for your sake, that the Earl's engineers have walked it too." And that was all. She made him no curtsy. She turned, and took up her cloak herself, because no footman moved, and walked out of the saloon, and down the long marble stair, and into the cold, clean autumn dark. And the doors of Thornleigh Hall closed behind the only person in it who had told him the truth. He kept the ring. He meant, that night, to send it back to its box, and think no more of it. It would be nearer the truth to say that he spent the next year meaning to send it back to its box, and turning it instead over and over in the dark, a small circle of deep water that would not let his fingers alone. In the hired chaise going home through the black lanes, she did not weep. Her father's old man Diggory drove, and once he turned round on the box, his seamed face working, and said, "Miss Charlotte, I'd have horsewhipped him, dukedom or no." She put her hand on his shoulder. "No, Diggory, he has done a far worse thing to himself than any whip could, and has not the first idea of it yet." For she was not angry. That was the thing about Charlotte Fenwick that Thornleigh had failed to notice, and would spend a full year learning at ruinous expense. She was almost never angry. She merely remembered, exactly and forever, the way a good level remembers true. What she had, going home in the dark, was a folded linen map. Her father's map of the Wenn, drawn in his own cramped hand and colored in his own weak washes, every drain and sluice and firm yard and soft one marked true to the inch, and the small blunt fact, which the Duke in his blazing saloon had entirely failed to reckon with, that the freehold of the one firm crossing had come to her, 4 weeks past, absolutely, and in her own sole name. She held, folded on her knee, the single gate through which the Duke's whole ambition, and any navigation that would ever be cut from the coal country to the sea, must one day pass. She did not yet know she would build it herself. But she knew that night that it would not be built without her, and the knowledge sat in her still hands quieter and heavier than grief. She did not go to London to be pitied. She went home to the low green valley, and she opened her father's plan chest, and she took up his work where his failing hands had set it down. Within the month a caller came jolting down the Fen road, Mr. Caleb Brandreth, the great canal engineer himself, a broad, plain-spoken north countryman of 60, who had corresponded with Jonas Fenwick for 20 years, and had actually wept, he told her, at the news of his death, because no other man in England had understood low water half so well. He had come meaning to buy the crossing for a company of northern ironmasters. He stayed to look at Jonas Fenwick's drawings, spread the great sheets on the fen-man's own table, and went silent for the better part of an hour. Then he said, "Miss Fenwick, your father did not leave a survey. He left a finished thing that only wanted the doing. Who holds this now?" And Charlotte said, "I do, absolutely, and in my own name." And Brandreth looked at her a long moment with his shrewd small eyes, and said, "Then, it is not the crossing I've come to buy, ma'am. It's the engineer. Will you build it?" They did not talk of dukes. They talked of levels and lock gates, the 14-foot fall below the mill, the cost of puddled clay, and whether the ironmaster's money could be got without the ironmaster's meddling. And through that hard, bright autumn Charlotte Fenwick did the thing no one had imagined a jilted girl in mourning could do. She petitioned the Crown's commissioners for the charter, not in a company's name, nor a duke's, but her own, Fenwick's Wenn Navigation, with Caleb Brandreth as her engineer and her father's finished plans as her whole argument. The commissioners, grave men who had seen 100 canal schemes drawn by hopeful fools, opened the Fenwick sheets and grew quiet in just the way Brandreth had. Here was no fantasy. Here was 30 years of a great practical mind, walked out stake by stake and drawn true to the inch, held by a gray-eyed young woman who answered every question without once rounding the figure. And here the story must do what a story of 2 lives in one falling year must do, and look for a while through the other window. The Duke of Thornleigh's year went as such years go. Lady Georgiana glittered on his arm through the winter, radiant and expensive, right up until the March morning her father's people were pressed at last for the settlements, and it was discovered, gently, then not gently, that the £60,000 was a fiction stitched out of mortgages, that the Earl of Marchmont was his land poor as the Duke and a great deal less honest, and that the beautiful bold cutting through the eastern hills, on which Sebastian had staked his charter and his name, could not be made by God or man. The Duke had married a fortune, and the fortune was a fraud. Worse, for a proud man, the whole ton knew it by April, and the joke went round the clubs in a sentence that turned his own toast against him. Thornleigh had refused the fen and married the bog, and would drown in it. He heard it. Proud men hear everything they pretend not to. And at night, in a great cold house he could no longer afford to light, his memory went back and back to a grey figure by a pillar, to a plain voice saying, "I hope the Earl's engineers have walked it too," and to a small circle of deep water that would not let his fingers alone. By summer, his charter was dead paper. A navigation that cannot cross the Wenn is a line drawn on air, and every commissioner in London now knew that the crossing belonged, absolutely and in her own name, to Miss Charlotte Fenwick, who had, moreover, a charter of her own, Caleb Brandreth's genius, and her father's finished plans, and was already letting the first contracts for the lower reach. The Duke's whole ambition, the one unspent asset of his blood, the name he had meant to carry into the next century, had run aground on 4 weeks of a will and a soft green valley he had been too ashamed to marry. Sowerby, greyer than ever, laid it before him without mercy. "Your Grace can have no navigation. There is one line to the sea. It runs through Miss Fenwick's ground, and Miss Fenwick is building it. If your Grace wishes his coal to reach the water in his lifetime, he must go to her, ask her leave to cross her canal, and pay her toll like any other man." Men who were with him said the Duke stood a long while at the window with his back to the room, and that when he turned he had the look of a man who hears the tide coming in over the flats and knows, to the yard, how far he has to run. He went in September, because pride starves slower than coal mines, and a duke with no ready money and 40,000 barren acres cannot eat his own name. He was shown not into a drawing room, but into a plain work office on the Fen road, a long deal table, good north light, the great survey sheets pinned edge to edge. And behind the table, in a plain grey working dress with the jet mourning brooch at her throat and her father's map open under her hands, sat the woman he had held out his palm to before 400 people. The 7th Duke of Thornleigh, who had walked into rooms for 31 years to find them rearranging themselves around him, stopped on the threshold of that office as though he had walked into cold glass, and for the first time in his life, a year and 11 days too late, really looked at her. He looked and could not stop, and what he saw had been standing by his pillar all along. The stillness that was not meekness, but pressure, held under control. The steady hazel eyes that measured a man the way they measured ground, once completely, without rounding. The plainness that was not plainness at all, but a lamp unlit in daylight, like his own great house at noon. He heard, from a distance of 1 year, his own carrying voice saying a fortune, not a fen, and the dry click of a sapphire dropped into his palm. And understood, with the tide at his knees, exactly what he had held out his open hand for and given away. "Your Grace," said Charlotte Fenwick, not rising, "you have come about the crossing. Sit down. It will not take long." He sat. Brandreth was there, and a clerk, and it was all done in the open, on the table, in figures. And this was the thing that undid Sebastian, and kept undoing him for months after. She was scrupulously, immaculately fair. He had come braced for the knife, for the slow squeezing revenge a wronged creditor is owed, and she gave him arithmetic. She granted his coal a right of passage through her lock. She set his toll at the common rate that any iron master or coal factor paid. Not a penny of vengeance loaded onto it, and she pushed a fair drawn agreement across the deal table with her own hand. When Brandreth murmured that the frontage charge might justly be set higher against a duke who had used her so, Charlotte said, without looking up from the figure, "The frontage is 11 chains of his bank, Mr. Brandreth, and 11 chains is what he pays for. We do not round it because the man is a duke, any more than we would have rounded it because the man is a fool, both, in his case, being true." And she signed. He sat with the pen in his own hand, and could not for a moment use it. Why? He said at last, low, not to Brandreth, not to the clerk, only to her. "You hold me here entirely. My whole name runs through your ground. Why these terms, and not the others you might have set?" She looked at him across the deal table, and her voice, when it came, was even and unhurried, and struck him harder than any fury could have done. "Because I do not round the figure, your grace. My father taught me that. You state the true one, though it costs you, and let the world arrange itself around the truth. The true figure of what you owe me for 11 chains of bank is on that paper, and it is exact, and it is all I want from you. Sign, please, Mr. Brandreth has the puddlers waiting at the lower reach." He signed. At the door he could not help it. A year of 3 in the morning honesty forced it up out of him. He turned. "Miss Fenwick, what I said, at my own ball, before my own people, that is not on the agreement, your grace," she said, already drawing the next sheet toward her. "Feelings do not carry a toll. Good day to you." He began to come early to the monthly attendances after that, and to sit in the plain outer room among coal factors and lime burners, and to hear through the door the level voice conducting an enterprise that grew, week by week, into the making of him. He watched her, across the deal table, catch her own clerk overcharging his account by £9 odd. His grace has been billed for 9 chains he does not front. The navigation does not keep what it has not earned, and push the coins back with her own bare hand. And he walked down the fen road that day, and stood a long while by his horse, unable to remember why he had brought it. It would have been easier, he thought, if she had squeezed him. A man can hate a creditor who robs him. There is no armor in a proud man's wardrobe against being treated, by the person you have wronged past mending, with perfect exactness and not one grain of spite. He began, clumsily, at 31, for the first time in his life unpurchased and unapplauded, to court her. Hothouse Flowers went down the fen road and came back the same evening with a civil line. "Miss Fenwick does not receive flowers at a place of business, which the office on the fen road is." He put money he did not have into the plate at the charity for the navigation's injured men, and had from her one grave inclination of the head, exactly measured. And in November, when Lady Georgiana Wenn, freed of him the moment his charter died, her father's ruin now common knowledge, married a returned nabob named Alderton with £100,000 out of Bengal, and was heard to say brilliantly at her own wedding breakfast that dukes were very well, but one did like a husband who could pay for the candles. The 7th Duke of Thornleigh was almost past wincing. Almost, he wrote her a letter at last. The honest one, 4 pages of it at 3 in the morning, the splinter drawn out at last with both hands, that he had jilted her not for Georgiana's beauty, nor even her lying fortune, but out of the plain unbearable shame of being seen to need a fen-man's daughter, that he had known, even as he held out his palm for the ring, that she was the one honest thing in the room, and the Earl's promise the one false one, that her father had drawn him a masterpiece, and he had called it a bog, that there was a sapphire in his desk drawer he had meant for a year to send back to its box, and could not make his hand do it. To all 4 pages she sent back one line. "In an engineer's steady rule of a hand, your grace, I am glad you have told the truth at last. It is the only currency I have ever valued, and it is late, and it changes nothing on the agreement. C. F." And so it came, in the spring, to the day the whole county still tells of. Fenwick's Wenn navigation was finished. 12 locks and 11 miles of still bright water from the coal country to the sea, cut true to the inch through the low green valley the fashionable had wrinkled their noses at, and it was to be opened by the king's own cousin, a shrewd, unhurried old royal duke, who cared nothing for beauty and everything for works that outlast the men who make them, and who had said he would very much like to shake the hand of the young woman who had built England a navigation her father drew. 4,000 people came, And they came, most of them, down a fine new towpath, and over a fine new bridge of pale stone at the crossing, the very firm crossing, the one gate in the valley, and set into the keystone of that bridge. Cut deep, where a man could read it from the middle of the water, were the words, Jonas Fenwick, fen-man, who drew this true. The Duke of Thornleigh was there. He came because his coal now went to the sea through her lock and paid her common toll, and because a broken man will go to watch the thing he threw away be crowned, the way a tongue goes to a sore tooth. He stood at the back, plainly dressed, his dead ambition under his feet in the shape of another name cut in stone, and watched the old royal Duke hand Charlotte Fenwick down to the water's edge and bow over her hand before 4,000 people and say, in a voice made to carry, "Madam, I am told you are the best engineer in England, and that your father was better, and that neither of you would ever round a figure. I have come to see whether England deserves you." She wore, that day, not grey. She wore a gown of deep sapphire silk, the first color anyone in the valley had ever seen on her, the exact deep water blue of a ring she had once handed back, and her father's jet brooch at her throat, and if anyone thought the plain brooch strange against so fine a gown, no one any longer dared to say so. And at the height of it, when the first barge came down through the top lock with its horn blowing, and the 4,000 cheered, and the water rose and carried it on, the 7th Duke of Thornleigh walked out from the back of the crowd, down the pale new towpath, to the foot of the bridge that bore another man's name, and before the king's cousin, and 4,000 souls, and the level water, and every person who had heard him hold out his palm, he went down, both knees, on the new stone of the crossing he had once refused to marry. Miss Fenwick. His voice carried. He had spent a family's 200 years of carrying voice on making sure of it. A year and a half ago, in my own house, before my own people, I held out my hand for a ring and called your father's life's work a bog. Every soul who laughed with me that night can hear me now. I cannot unsay it, I have tried. A man cannot. I am asking you, on my knees, on your bridge, owning every farthing of what I am, and every yard of what I threw away, for the honor I held out my open hand and refused. I am asking you to be my wife, and my duchess, and to take my name. The silence that came down had a texture to it. People said afterward you could feel it on the skin. Somewhere a horn died away. Somewhere the new water lapped the new stone. And Charlotte Fenwick looked down at the kneeling Duke a long level moment, and those nearest swore ever after that there was no triumph in her face at all. None. And that this was the terrible thing about it. She looked at him the way she looked at a fall of ground, once, completely, measuring what was truly there. "Your Grace," she said, and the quiet of her carried to the far bank because 4,000 people were helping it. "Stand up. I will not have a man kneel to me on my father's stone. He never asked any man to kneel, and I will not begin it here." She waited until he had risen, unsteady, before she went on. "You have asked me to take your name. I have a name. It is cut in that keystone behind you, where all England can read it, and it will be there when your title has gone back to the crown, for want of an heir who can pay for the candles. I do not want to be your duchess. A duchess is a fortune you plant your name in, and I have watched what you do to a fortune." She let that stand a moment, in the lapping quiet. And then she did the thing no one on either bank had imagined, the thing that was the whole difference between them, and that turned the last screw of his undoing tighter than any refusal could have. "But you told the truth in your letter," she said more quietly, so that people leaned to hear it, "and truth is the only currency I have ever valued, and you paid it late, but you paid it in full, so I will not send you away. Here is my figure, your Grace, and it is exact, and I will not round it. Give up the name. Give up the navigation you meant to carry into the next century, for it is built, and it is not yours, and it never will be. Come down into the valley you were ashamed to marry, and learn low water from Mr. Brandreth as an apprentice learns it, on your knees in the wet clay with the rest of my men, and be no one's grace, but only mine, and in 5 years, if your hands have learned to draw a level true, I will marry a working engineer of the Wenn, who happens once to have been a duke. That is the whole of what I have to offer. It is a great deal less than a coronet. Take a day to think of it. Most men would sooner have the coronet. He did not take the day. He took off his fine coat there on the towpath, in front of the king's cousin and 4,000 souls, and Caleb Brandreth, who missed nothing and forgave more than people knew, put a puddler's spade into the hands of the 7th Duke of Thornleigh, and the crowd did not know whether to cheer or weep, and did both. It was not a fairy tale. Nobody's fairy tale ends with a duke to his elbows in a lock pit, learning to read a spirit level, while the woman he wronged watches from the bank without softening. But it was the truth, drawn true to the inch, and she had never in her life valued anything else. They were married 5 years later, almost to the day, in the small gray church above the valley. And by then, no one within 20 miles thought of Sebastian as a duke, because he had become something the valley respected far more, a man who could be trusted with water. He kept the title, it meant nothing, and the meaning of nothing to him was the whole of his cure. The great barren house was let to a school. The navigation carried the Fenwick name to the sea, and back 100 times a day. And the tolls made Charlotte rich, and she paid every man in coin on the day it fell due, and never once rounded a figure. On their wedding morning she gave him back the sapphire. He had carried it in a drawer for 6 years, unable to send it to its box, cut down now and reset small and plain, no longer alone against anything, and he wore it on the hand that had learned to hold a level, the only ornament the man ever afterward owned. She was asked once, an old woman by then, by a young person too new to the valley to be frightened of her, whether she had ever forgiven the Duke of Thornleigh for what he did at his ball. And Charlotte Fenwick, Charlotte Thornleigh, the parish register said, though the navigation and the school and the bridge all said Fenwick, and always would, considered the question with that old level attention, as though checking a fall of ground, and said at last, "Forgive him? My dear, I did far better. I put a spade in his hands. A duke plants his name in a fortune, he told 400 people, not a fen. I have spent 30 happy years teaching that particular duke that the fen was the fortune, and that he was very nearly too proud and too ashamed to be allowed to touch it. He learned, late and on his knees in the wet clay with the rest of my men. That is more than most men ever do, and more than he deserved, and I have never once been sorry I stayed on the bank long enough to find it out." That is the account, entire, of Sebastian, 7th Duke of Thornleigh, who was offered an honest crossing and a grave grey girl in mourning, and held out his open hand for the ring instead, who called a masterpiece a bog because he could not bear to be seen to need it, and who lost the diamond, the fortune, the charter, and the name he meant to carry into the next century, all in a single falling year, to 4 weeks of a will and a soft green valley. He knelt at last on another man's bridge, on the very crossing he had refused, and was not refused, but undone, stripped of everything that had made him a duke, handed a spade, and told to earn from the bottom of a lock pit the one fortune his open hand had thrown away. The tide he had heard coming over the flats came in exactly as he had reckoned it. It simply did not drown him. It set him down in the wet clay where the real work was, beside the only person who had ever told him the truth, and that, in the valley of the Wenn, is what they mean when they say a man has been well and truly undone. If this story of a proud duke and the quiet woman who outbuilt him held you all the way to the water, do a kind thing for the storytellers. Press the like button, and share it with a fellow lover of grounded historical romance and deeply drawn slow-burn drama. Subscribe to The Duke's Undoing, so you never miss the next chapter of a proud man learning, too late or almost too late, exactly what he threw away. And tell us below, for we read every answer, when he knelt on her bridge and offered her his name, should she have taken it? Or was the spade the truer gift?